How many believe in the resurrection of the dead? Well, if you don't, you will after today. Because Benjamin Franklin has been resurrected. And God has sent him back with a message to share with us today. And we're really excited to have Benjamin Franklin here. Now listen, here's what we're going to try to do. Because we believe it's so significant that we have someone of such stature as Benjamin Franklin here, and you children will be hearing about him in history. We hope they still teach about him in history. We're going to try to have our children remain in the service today so they can have an opportunity to hear what he has to say. So thank you. We were hoping for some thunder clouds, and we were going to put a kite up there for you with a key on it, but it didn't happen.
Well, I'm glad you didn't, because one time I was flying that kite, and I've had senior moments ever since. Thank you. My name is Benjamin Franklin. My impersonator is Ron Teel, who's solely responsible for everything I say. I was born back in 1706 up in Boston, and as a young man I left and went to Philadelphia, and that's where I resided, except when I was over in England, back and forth, and a little bit of time in France. Now, some of you remember me from writing. I used to write things, and I had little phrases. And some of you gentlemen who have a little bald head remind me of apples. And I wrote something once about that. Let's see if you remember it. An apple a day. Yes. Aren't you glad I didn't say a lemon a day? And let's see, does anybody remember some of the other things I said? Yes. And one is a penny. Yes, you ought to send that down to Washington. And early. Yes, I'll tell you, the kids did not like that one. And so they had their own version. They said early to bed and early to rise, and the girls go out with other guys. Now here's one you may not remember. Only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. Only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. When I came out of the Constitutional Congress, a young lady stopped and asked me, Dr. Franklin, what kind of government have you given us? And I said, a republic, if you can keep it. I want to talk to you about that. Because only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. John Adams said about our Constitution, it is only good for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate for the governing of any others. Now, I want you to come back to my time. My time, I'm going to have you come back to 1787. And we're going to go to Independence Hall. It was once called Carpenter's Hall, but after we signed the Declaration, it became Independence Hall. And I'm going to have you come back to it to 1787. So I want you to prepare for this trip. You're going to have to shut off your cell phones because you're not going to have them. There's no cell towers back then. You're going to have to give up your radio and your television and your newspapers. And you know, you're even going to have to give up football and baseball. And you're going to come back to my time, 1787. In fact, while we're here, now that you've made that trip, I'm going to have you go a little bit further. I'm going to go back to 1620. Because at that time, the pilgrims making their first settlers making their trip to our country were out in Massachusetts Bay. And before they ever set foot on that rock, they sat around a table. And on this table, they drew up a compact. You know it as the Mayflower Compact. That Mayflower Compact said their purpose of coming to this new world was, quote, advancement of the Christian faith. Now, they had other purposes. That's in the first sentence, advancement of the Christian faith. I tell you that because that's the origin. That's the day this new nation began. That's when the birth pangs began. Now we had a revolution later. We had Constitution. We've had a Civil War, a lot of other things. But that's the point. That's the day that our new nation began, in 1620. Those who would say our nation was not based on Christian principles, those who would want to tell you that Christianity and faith and religion had nothing to do with our nation, I ask them and I ask you about the Mayflower Compact, what part of that phrase, advancement of the Christian faith, do they not understand? My friends, the origin of our nation was based on Christian principles. My mother was born out in Nantucket Island about 40 years after those first settlers came, and she knew some of the families. And she would instill in us children the values of the Puritan faith at that time. Now, mothers have a way, you mothers know this, but mothers have a way of instilling things into their children, certain values. I was the 15th of 17 children. By the time they got to me, Mother had perfected that very well. And the values of work, the values of faith were instilled in all of us children. And one of the things they told us, and repeated constantly, was one of the first acts the Pilgrims did was pass what they call the Old Deluder Satan Act. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, the Old Deluder Satan Act. I love those old legislations that they do like that because they say what it means. Nowadays they'll say one thing and it means something else. But then the Old Deluder Satan Act, and it says in there, it being the purpose of that old deluder Satan to keep people from the knowledge of the Scriptures. Therefore, whenever there's 50 households in an area, they will form together and they'll teach the young people how to read and write. That is the origin, my friends. That's the very origin of our public school system. To teach people to read and write. And why to read and write? So they can read the Scriptures. Now, you may not think much about that today. But think of the time in the 1620s. The Bible had only begun to be printed. Johann Gutenberg had only invented the press some 100 years or so earlier. And they had began printing the Bible, and they were now available to people. Up until then, the Bible, you couldn't, in some nations, if you had it, that was a crime for you to possess a Bible. Only the clergy had the right to own a Bible and to have it. And only the clergy was going to tell you what it said. And only the clergy was going to tell you what it meant. But now the Bible could be printed. And it could be mass-produced. And it could be available. And now if we teach people how to read, they can read the Scriptures themselves. And then they can determine what it says. Not relying on the clergy. And that was an important ingredient. Knowing to be able to read, and we read. So the origins, I tell you, the origins of our country are based on Christian principles, and there's a reason I want to tell you this. Because in your day, you're soon going to have an election. And there's going to be a lot of debate in your election. Oh, should we elect people of faith to office or not? Or does it even matter? Was our nation a Christian nation, or was it a secular nation? Or does it even matter? You're going to hear that debate. And it's nothing unique to your time. That debate has gone on ever since we began and formed our nation. But I want you to know the roots of our nation. I want you to know the origin of it. It was based on advancement of the Christian faith, and then for the people to be able to read so they could read the Scriptures themselves. I got to go to school. 2 years I got to go to school. Oh, I was fortunate. 2 years. George Washington, he lived a little richer life, and he got to go to 6 years. But in 2 years, that was enough for me to learn how to read. And then it was up to me to read the rest and advance my own knowledge. And when I was down in Philadelphia, there were so few books that we formed a lending library, and we'd loan it back, books back and forth so we could all read and consume them. And that began your first public library. I'm glad I had a hand in that. Didn't think of it so much at that time. Being a interesting people, reading, we went to church. Because in church was where the most knowledgeable, educated person existed, and that was the pastor. He had gone to Yale. He had gone to Harvard. He had gone to Princeton. Those were colleges and universities set up to teach the ministry. And we all went to church to learn. That was our communication system. That's where we would learn what was happening in another village, because most of us in our life never traveled more than 25 miles from our home. So that's where we got to learn what was happening maybe in another colony, because we didn't talk to other colonies. Our conversation between colonies was between us and England. So we had very little conversation going up and down. People up in Massachusetts never talked to the people in Georgia. People in Georgia didn't talk to people in Virginia. And none of the colonies talked to the people in New York. The church was where we got our information. By the time of our revolution, 75% or over 75% of everybody went to church every Sunday. Now, that's 3 out of every 4 people. That's not 3 out of every 4 people that belong to your church. No, that's 3 about every 4 people in Hague, or down in Glens Falls, or down in New York City, or in Philadelphia, or down in Virginia. 3 out of every 4. If you had 3 out of every 4 people going to church now, Pastor, you'd have to preach all day long. Oh, you ought to see that smile on his face right now. All day long. The churches were packed. The average person in our country, in their lifetime, heard some 10,000 sermons. No, 7,000 sermons. Some 7,000 sermons in their life. The average sermon was an hour and a half long. Oh, you don't know about an hour and a half long sermon. I understand. 10,000 hours of instruction. 10,000 hours of concentrated instruction in the Bible. That's enough if you were going to college to earn 2 college degrees. We were a knowledgeable people. We were a faithful people. We had an evangelist come over from England named George Whitefield. I mean, maybe many of you have heard of him. You should have, because of the Wesleyan involvement of your church. He brought over an important message to us. It was a message that we had free will. Free will was new to the concept. Now let me help you for a moment, because this is important for you to understand why we have freedoms in our nation and how we structured ourselves. Critical. Up until when he came here, most of us were instructed in the concept of predestination. And there's a lot of validity to predestination. But predestination had become corrupted in the merger between the church and the state. And they were using predestination to keep people in their place. So if you were rich, it was because God wanted you to be rich. And if you were poor, it was because God wanted you to be poor. And if it was your duty to pay taxes, it's because God wanted you to pay taxes. And shut up and stay where you belong. And that was what was happening, so we had our class system. Here George Whitefield comes along and says, you got free choice. You have a choice of accepting God. You have a choice of rejecting God, too. And you have some choices in what happens to you. And that stirred us. And you gave a name to this. You call it the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening. That's why we ended up with 3 out of every 4 people going to church. It was a Great Awakening. And we learned that we could have our choices of what we do in life. We learned that it was all right to own property. It was all right to acquire wealth if you didn't have wealth. It was all right to fail and step up and start again. Free will was tantalized us, changed us. And we began reading the Scriptures so much, and 2 Scriptures stood out. 2 Scriptures were quoted up and down the colonies. One is out of the Psalms. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. And the other one out of 2 Corinthians, I think, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. These 2 Scriptures you could hear in almost every sermon that was being preached in all the colonies. I told you that we don't talk. The colonies don't talk to each other. That is true. Very little commerce. All of our commerce was with England. But our faith began to tie us all together. And it was the faith that brought us together till we got to the point of the revolution. And by this time, we were united in a common faith and belief. And that's what helped drive us, because the people in churches, they were the ones who were telling us, the pastors, the priests, they were the ones who were telling us it was okay to revolt. Remember, it says in the scriptures, God appoints those over you. You are to obey your masters. He appoints the governors. He puts the kings in and he replaces the king. And we were listening to that, and we were having a bad king. We were having real troubles with England. And we were struggling with that because we're supposed to live with it. And yet something was telling us this isn't right. And it was the preachers that helped us understand it was all right at the time to step away. That God, who creates nations, also destroys them. And that was all right. And we began to believe very much, because there was a discussion called the covenant theology that was being discussed. I won't take too much time on that, but basically back in Deuteronomy, when Moses was running that ragtag group of people around the desert, and he ended up speaking to them, he said, God will bless you if you honor God. He will create you, or he will destroy you. But he might turn you into the greatest nation on earth. And as we looked back over history, we said, well, where was the greatest nation in earth? At most, maybe for a few years when Solomon was king, possibly, but not sure. Where was the greatest nation that God ever created? And we began to dare think, maybe that is yet to come. And maybe we could be that nation. What do we have to do? We looked in the Bible, and in Micah they have a great statement. It says, and he said, Lord, what do you want of us? And it is to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with the Lord. That was simple. We could do that. And remember, 3 out of 4 of us went to church every Sunday. We went to church because we loved to learn what the Scriptures had to say. In fact, the ushers would have a feather on the end of their stick. And if you were falling to sleep, they would reach down the aisle and they'd rub that under your nose and wake you up. And they had a reason for it. People wanted it because they didn't want to miss what was being said. We were religious people. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And dare we think that we could become the greatest nation in the world? All we had to do was honor God. Act justly. Love mercy. Walk humbly with God. That wasn't that hard. Well, we had the revolution. Now, you remember, you are in Independence Hall, 1787. But I want you now to step back to 1776. John Adams is trying to get the people to vote, to have the independence, to vote for independence. He gets up and he says, independence now! Independence forever! He does it in that Bostonian accent I can't do. And he was a good speaker. And nobody would do anything. He got so frustrated. He once said to them, you know, one useless man is a disgrace. 2 useless men is a law firm. 3 useless men or more is a Congress. And this is the most useless Congress I've ever seen. He was so frustrated. Well, he just finished saying, independence now, independence forever. And nobody acted on it. And then in from the back door comes this guy dripping wet, this little thin guy. And he runs up to the front and he takes his cloak that's full of mud, throws it on the floor. And he says, I'm from New Jersey, and I represent New Jersey, and New Jersey is ready to vote for independence. We will rot if we don't vote. That was the thing that moved us. His name was John Witherspoon, head of the Princeton College, they called it at the time. The symbolism didn't escape us, because it wasn't the lawyer that got us to vote. It wasn't the businessman or the farmer. It was John Witherspoon, the preacher man, who got us to vote. The preacher man. Now, like any good body, we got to vote, and someone says, wait, before you can vote, you got to have something to vote on. You got to have a piece of paper. So what do? Just like any good group, first thing you got to do something, you form a committee. Isn't that what you do? You form a committee. So they said, okay, let's have John Adams, you want this so bad, you get on the committee. Benjamin Franklin, you get on the committee. Mr. Livingston, you get on. Mr. Sherman, you get on. And young Thomas Jefferson over there, you get on this committee too. So we all form a committee. Now, what does a good committee do? Well, the first thing it does is find somebody to do all the work, and the rest of them leave town. So we got Thomas Jefferson. Well, first we wanted John Adams to do it. And John Adams says, no, they don't like me. I'm obnoxious. And he was. And so he said, then he wanted me to write it. And I said, I don't do serious stuff. I do light stuff. Early to bed, early to rise. That won't fit into the Declaration of Independence. Livingston and Sherman didn't want it. And young Thomas, you write it. And he said, wait just a minute. I just got married not too long ago. I haven't seen my bride for a while, and I really want to get back to being some time with her. And he said, fine. The faster you write, the faster you'll get back to be with her. And we gave him some instruction, we left. And we came back, and he'd written some pretty good stuff. I marked it up a little bit. John Adams marked it up. And then we sent it to the whole Congress, and they just tore it up. Oh, they did it they chopped it unmercifully. You may not know that. But I tell you, the final document was not written by Thomas Jefferson, although he drafted most of it. Me or the committee is written by the whole Congress. One of them said, we don't have any reference to the Creator in here. So they added that, remembering our origin, advancement of the Christian faith, and the Great Awakening. Why don't we have a reference? So we got that in there. Did some others. And in my opinion, the final document was the greatest document written by man. By man. And there's two sentences in it that are important for you to understand. They're Christian principles, and that's why I tell you this. The two sentences, the most two sentences. Young people, when you go to school, you'll learn this part of it. We hold these truths. Well, maybe you know it. If you do, you can say it with me. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We hold these truths. These were not party platforms. They were not some fringe elements' ideas. These were truths. Truths so evident, you didn't even have to prove them. That all men are created equal. Let me tell you, that's a Christian principle. You won't find that in any other faith. I don't know what's out there now that may pose as a faith, but back in my time, there's no other faith that said all men were created equal. They all had superior and inferior people, but not the Christian faith. All of us are going to be invited to the table. We all will have a seat at the table. That we were created with certain rights, and these rights are not given by man, they're not given by government, and therefore cannot be taken away by man, cannot be taken away by government. These are rights given to us by God. And that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Our revolution was based on that. Our revolution was as much a military exchange, as much a political exchange, as it was primarily a religious event. All men are created equal by God, with rights given to us by God, not by the King of England, not even by what would become our Congress. Christian principle. Well, you know the results of that. We won by miracles. If you ever want to read more about what happened in our time, read about the Revolutionary War. You cannot go away without being inspired and seeing the hand of God in so many places, because we had no army. We were ragtag people. We had a commander, George Washington, who had only had a history of failure, pretty much. We against the world's greatest military. Oh, but you read about that, and you just marvel at the hand of God. It was a religious event. Now we come together, and that's why I brought you here to 1787. We come together to build a new Constitution. But our Constitution, it is based on Christian principles. I'll just give you one. The separation of powers. You know that. We have an executive, we have a judicial, we have a legislative branch. That's not nothing new. That's in the Bible in Isaiah, but it's also in the Greek documents. It's not new. But all the governments we looked at all believed that man was good and that man could excel and that man could make life better. Heck, all we had to do was look in a mirror to know the foolishness of that argument. You give man power and he can get corrupted so fast. We knew that underneath our skin is a sinful man. That's a Christian principle. And so we put checks and balances in there. And that's what's important for you to understand. That's the Christian principle in our Constitution. The checks and balances. So that no one part of the government can be dictatorial over the other part. And we may get a bad Congress, we can throw them out. We may get a bad president, we can check them by the Congress because they're the ones who give them the money. We may get a bad judiciary, we can overrule them, write new laws. We got different ways, but that's our way because we know man is fundamentally a sinful person. And if you give him power, that power can corrupt, and absolute power, as you know, corrupts absolutely. So we have a Declaration of Independence that's based on Christian principle, our revolution. You have a Constitution that's based on Christian principle. But now let me tell you what you do with this information. Here's what you do. You see? You need to be sure that you elect people who are faithful. John Jay, the first Supreme Court Justice of our nation, said, "Providence has given us the choice of our rulers. And it is the duty of our Christian nation to select Christians for our rulers." Well, I like John Jay, but I'll tell you, I have met some Christians I don't want to be my rulers. And perhaps you have too. I like what Jacob, no, that's not his name. Who is Moses' father-in-law? I forgot his name. I'm having one of those senior moments. Okay. Anyway, here's again Moses running these people all around the desert for 40 years. And he's trying to make all the decisions himself. And his father-in-law comes up and says, "Moses, you got to change. Here's what you need to do. Go select capable men from among the people. People who fear God. Trustworthy men who hate dishonest gain. And let me suggest to you, there's a good standard to hold anyone to. Capable men. The first thing you need to be sure is that they're capable for whatever office you're elected in. Whether it's dog catcher all the way up to president. Capable. Second, men who fear God. That means they honor God, they respect God, they understand God. Trustworthy men who hate dishonest gain. You can look at the record. Be thankful for the press. You may think that you may get aggravated them at the time, but one of the jobs they do, hopefully, is will expose if somebody has not been trustworthy, has been dishonest. Sam Adams said, nothing is more important than the character of our public officials, and we should examine them carefully. If we select men who are praying men, then you will select people who will listen to God. And that's what you can hope for. I'm going to conclude with just a little thing to help you understand the importance of that phrase. You see, I brought you back here to June 1787 on purpose. I brought you back actually to June 28th, 1787. Because on this day, in our debate over the new Constitution, we were about ready to split. 4 states said, if we can't reach agreement, we're going to walk. And we're no longer have the euphoria of the revolution. We've got conflict among us. We are angry. And I saw that if those 4 states walk, our nation dies before it was even really structured. So I got up and I spoke. And I'm thankful to James Madison, who kept a record of this. So if you allow me, I'm going to share my words, and then we're going to close. I got up, and I said, Mr. President, we seem to be in want of political wisdom, are running around looking for it. Why, we've gone back to ancient times, and we looked at the governments of that era, and we looked at the governments over in Europe now, and we find none of them have a constitution suitable to our cause. Given our search, groping as we are in the dark, I doubt we would ever recognize political wisdom if we saw it, if it was handed to us. How has it happened, sir, that not once in all of our deliberations have we sought the illuminator of lights to show us the way, give us light, give us understanding? Why, when we were in the battle with Great Britain, and we were sensible to the dangers about us, why, Mr. President, we had prayers in this room every day. And our prayers, sir, were graciously answered. Do we think now that we no longer need his assistance? Do we think we can accomplish this building on our own? Mr. President, I've lived a long time. And the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this, that God does govern in the affairs of man. Why, if a sparrow can't fall without his knowledge, do we think an empire can rise without his aid? We've been told in the good book that unless the Lord build this house, we will labor in vain who try to build it. I believe that firmly. Therefore, Mr. President, I move that we have prayers in here every morning, prayers to illuminate our understanding before we get down to business. Thank you. Well, I sat down. There was some discussion. Then there was a decision to recess for a few days. And I know during this time there was a lot of praying that took place. I don't know what else happened. But when we came back, there was a spirit of conciliation instead of conflict. And soon we reached that what you now call the Great Compromise. And soon you got the Constitution. And Alexander says that Constitution couldn't have happened without the finger of God in it, because there's no way with us, as diversified as we were, that we could have ever reached such an agreement. And I tell you this, that since the first day of Congress that began in 1789, they have prayers every morning before they begin their deliberation. And it has happened up to your day today. So if anybody ever wants to tell you that our country was not founded on Christian principles, why, you tell them, well, I tell you what you can tell them. You can tell them what somebody once told Ben Franklin. You tell them, go fly a kite. Thank you very much.